It's okay, I'll stand up here, but you can just...
I will need the mic, so, yeah. Is that one up there working?
Okay, well, welcome back. I'm David Black from Dalhousie University. I also want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. We've all been enjoined to situate ourselves in relation to Linda Freeman. I was a young PhD student writing about Canadian policy towards Southern Africa in early 1990s. And I must say that Linda was both a tremendous aid and inspiration, but also a source of intimidation because I, like Chris Brown, waited with bated breath every year for the annual assessment of Canadian policy towards Southern Africa and Southern Africa report. But of course it raised the question of what could one possibly add to the accounts that were being provided. So I dealt with that by thinking about Canada comparatively and relating it to a bunch of other countries, and that was how I got around it. But Linda has made a tremendous contribution to the field. Her account remains the account to which all others must respond and engage with. And so thank you, Linda, for your contribution to this part of your scholarly journey. This session is devoted to transnational civil society. In many ways, it builds directly on some of the themes that were raised in the last session. One of the features of Solidarity Politics in Canada was the breadth, depth, and longevity of the connections across a wide range of societal actors, trade unions, non-governmental development organizations, the churches, various arts and educational institutions, human rights, lawyers, and unfortunately we have only a very small sample of that breadth. But I think that activity was in many ways a really important precursor when we think about how it may have influenced subsequent events. I think there are a variety of campaigns that took a great deal of inspiration from the work of the anti-apartheid movement, but I think as well, none of them matched that breadth, depth, and longevity, and the depth of expertise that was built up in the process. Unfortunately, Erwin Kotler, who was supposed to be here, is ill and unable to make it today, so we have two presenters who represent in different ways two aspects of this engagement. Moira Hutchison from the long time service with the Task Force on the Churches and Corporate Responsibility, and the theme of ethical investment, I guess, more broadly, and David Gallagher, who was a long-time leader within the non-governmental development community with Oxfam and CARE and QSO, but most of his time in Southern Africa with Oxfam. And so Moira is going to lead off, and then David will speak, and there will be time for question and answer. He's going to speak for about 16 minutes.
Thank you for the is this working? No. Can I put this in here?
Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to honor Linda Freeman today. My experience of her is only as someone who was a sympathetic and strong supporter of the organization I worked for, so I know nothing about intimidation. And I must confess, however, that there are other Canadian church activists who were in the anti-apartheid campaign who I wish could have been representing the churches here today. In particular, I'm thinking of Jim Kirkwood and Renata Pratt. Both are unable to participate for health reasons, but I met with Jim a couple of weeks ago and had a good conversation. Jim, as a United Church staff person, played a key role in grassroots mobilization and education and partnership relations delegations from South Africa. However, my contribution here today will draw more specifically on the lessons learned by the Task Force on the Churches and Corporate Responsibility, the ecumenical coalition where I worked with Renata Pratt for 5 of my 10 years on its staff. Renata was the founding coordinator and the driving force behind the task force, and wrote the compelling book, In Good Faith, Canadian Churches Against Apartheid. And if you haven't read it, I urge you to do so. I'm going to refer to this coalition in this talk by its acronym, TCCR, as TICKR, because that's what we called it in those days. TICKR, for those not familiar with it, was a coalition of national Protestant Catholic churches and religious communities founded in 1975 and carrying on until the late 1990s. It represented the churches as investors. Its mandate was to assist their treasury and pension funds in considering the impact of the companies in which they were invested. Its agenda was broad. It focused on Canadian companies and their human rights and environmental impacts around the world, and I should add, included issues of the impact of companies where there was development going on in unceded First Nations lands. For most of its existence in the early years, however, South Africa was its priority. And while TICKR sometimes initiated grassroots campaigns against apartheid, its core work was corporate and government research and advocacy. One of its strengths was that it represented the official positions of the member churches. In those days before declining church participation and influence, it could not be easily dismissed by governments or companies as just another NGO, although the response of companies and government was sometimes dismissive or hostile. We often had to persist with many reminders to get the meetings and written responses that we very politely demanded from cabinet ministers and CEOs. Of course, representing official church positions was also sometimes a limitation, as the member churches, reflecting the positions of their partner churches in South Africa, did not all come to the same conclusions at the same time about sanctions. However, in the long run, that really didn't matter because there was a clear consensus on the need to end strategic trade, investment, and loans, and this provided a huge agenda for common work by the churches, given the very slow response of Canadian companies and the government on any but some very weak voluntary sanctions. So we were asked to reflect on both what we learned from this period and also what we might think about in the future. First, companies hate the hassle factor of shareholders requesting meetings with management, asking questions at company annual meetings, or even worse from their point of view, filing shareholder proposals for circulation at before the annual meeting for vote by all the shareholders. We pushed ourselves into the corporate inner rooms where we were a really unwelcome intrusion into business as usual. For example, I remember that there was one early incident when they weren't used to this yet, where one of the banks shut the mic off on a representative of the churches who was speaking at an annual meeting. And companies went to great lengths to try to prevent us from circulating our proposals formally, including court action by both Massey Ferguson, later called Verity Corporation, and Massey Ferguson, you may remember, was headed up by Conrad Black, and Shell Canada. So companies often asked us, if you don't like what we're doing, why don't you just sell your shares and go away? Secondly, we learned that we were more likely to get support from other shareholders and also avoid regulatory challenges if we focused our proposals on information seeking. And actually, Renata Pratt believed very strongly that one of our most important contributions to the Canadian anti-apartheid campaign was exactly that the information that we dug out lifted the veil on what companies were doing. So our initial proposals tended to ask companies to review and report or to disclose policy criteria, although later we more directly asked that companies discontinue certain activities, disinvest, terminate agreements, and so on. In the area of bank loans, there was great demand for the information that we could provide, and we did this in frequently updated pamphlets entitled A Few Words from the Canadian Banks. It was a sellout publication. It simply detailed the amounts, the recipients, and the due dates of Canadian loans to the South African government and its agencies, and the policy positions of the banks. Third, we found that what we learned through the process of meetings and correspondence with company managements was of real importance in our advocacy with government, because we didn't focus just on companies. We were also doing advocacy with the Canadian government. And if you read the detailed accounts of our correspondence and meetings with companies, you'll realize how much we learned through that process. In many instances, we knew far more than government appeared to know about what Canadian companies were doing in South Africa, and I don't think this was just the government playing innocent. This helped sharpen our focus the focus of our advocacy with government and give us confidence that we were on the right track. Fourth, we learned that it's important to keep clear the distinction between disinvestment and divestment. It's a term that's maybe not much used these days, the distinction, but I think it's important. Disinvestment was our goal, getting companies to disinvest from or leave South Africa. Divestment, that is an investor selling shares in a company, was just one tool for trying to persuade the company to disinvest from or leave South Africa. And this other tool, shareholder activism, was the tool that Ticker emphasized. At the time, however, many investors assumed that divestment, or selling your shares, was the only choice, and that somehow victory was in hand as soon as they had sold their shares. Ticker members, however, believed in stepping up the pressure on a company to disinvest in a series of actions rather than in a single divestment action that sometimes became history the day after it had occurred. I think there was a role for both, for investors who divested and also for shareholder action. In fact, the United Church did eventually divest after many years of shareholder action. However, what I call the clean hands approach of some institutional investors, including universities, was regrettable. They, like the companies, appeared mostly to want to get rid of the hassle factor of students and others campaigning for them to divest from companies that were contributing to apartheid. Of course, the campaigns for divestment were an important rallying point for students, and I don't want to dismiss the importance of that in terms of shaping public opinion. But it has to be remembered that the financial impact on the companies from which they divested was negligible. And also these institutional investors, while responding to student pressure, for example, made little or no effort to first use their considerable human and financial resources to bring pressure to bear on the companies before making the decision to divest from them. Nor did they put in place structures and processes to ensure long-term monitoring of their investments in relation to other social and environmental issues. They responded with what I would see as a crisis management approach to their constituencies' activism, rather than making a commitment to responsible investment over the long term. Fifth, and in hindsight, we know that while we sometimes thought we were having an effect on certain outcomes, we were often wrong. Many decisions by government and business were related to forces of which we were unaware, although at the time we thought we could maybe take some pride in having made it happen. We know, of course, that in some very specific cases, Alcan's disinvestment from Hewlett Aluminum in South Africa, for example, we had had a clear impact. And more generally, we now know that we were contributing, albeit in a small way, to the ripple effect of withdrawals from South Africa and the cessation of lending that in turn helped undermine business confidence. So the second question we were asked to address was, what did we learn that might be relevant for today in our efforts to address social justice issues? You may be aware of the huge increase in recent years of what we used to call socially responsible or ethical investment, and now generally call simply responsible investment. Most of this interest focuses on stock selection, screening out companies engaged in activities we don't like, such as tobacco, for example, or seeking out companies that are the best of sector in a certain industry, even in difficult sectors like mining, or seeking out companies in which a social good is a priority, for example, low-cost housing or new energy technologies. This is all good, but this is mostly a behind-the-scenes and very apolitical kind of process. What is largely missing, with a few notable exceptions, is the active and sometimes public engagement by shareholders to address the many problems stemming from corporate activity that are not solved by an ethical screen or by divestment. For example, you may decide to divest from the largest fossil fuel companies, but what do you say about all the other companies across virtually all sectors, manufacturing and transportation, for example, whose activities are also very important as we try to address the issue of the carbon footprint? Here, most universities are still missing in action. And I'm mentioning universities in particular, given the venue and audience for this conference. Many of you are beneficiaries of pension or endowment funds that have absolutely no strategy for shareholder engagement. Their investment committees may not even properly monitor how their investment managers are voting on the proposals brought to the annual meetings of companies on issues of public importance. Fortunately, there are still some investors who are active shareholders. A leading example in Canada is the not-for-profit organization SHARE, the Shareholder Association for Research and Education, and it grew out of the ashes of Ticker. In fact, the head of SHARE worked on the staff of the task force at one point. In many ways, SHARE is stronger than Ticker because it is multi-sector. It includes not only some faith-based organizations, but also foundations, educational institutions, a few, pension funds, and fund companies. The key themes on its current agenda are reconciliation with First Nations, climate change, and employee and board diversity. I'll leave you with a great example of what active shareholders can do today, an example that has many similarities to the issues we addressed in the anti-apartheid campaign. Most of you will know of Morocco's claim that Western Sahara is part of its territory. However, Morocco's claim is not recognized by the International Court of Justice or by the United Nations, and serious human rights violations have been reported in the territory. It is sometimes called Africa's last colony. Two Canadian companies, Agrium and Potash Corporation, have been importing phosphate rock from the territory, helping to deplete a non-renewable resource of great importance to the local economy. With the help of SHARE, some of its clients, the United Church of Canada, the Congregation of the Sisters of Mercy of Newfoundland, and Ocean Rock Investments, filed shareholder proposals in 2015 and 2016 asking for independent human rights assessment, proposals which received considerable support and publicity. The two companies have recently merged into one called Nutrien, and in January of this year, the chief executive officer told an investors conference that one of the phosphate contracts had been ended with the other under review, and that, quote, the long-term goal is not to have a Western Sahara issue as part of the new company going forward. He added that, quote, we've certainly heard that from several of our shareholders as their preference. I won't claim, of course, that shareholder action was the main part of this story. There are many other actions that have contributed to this outcome, including a recent South African court decision stating that a container shipment of phosphates held in Port Elizabeth belongs to the Sahrawi Republic. But as in the anti-apartheid shareholder engagement I have discussed, investors in Nutrien raised their voices to address an issue of both injustice and corporate risk. In fact, the parallels with earlier campaigns are clear to me. Many of you will recognize the similarities of this Western Sahara case to the case of Namibia during the anti-apartheid period, when Canadian companies assisted in the exploitation of Namibia's uranium resources, as it was then illegally occupied by South Africa. In both cases, Namibia and now Western Sahara, shareholder action was a small but nonetheless important addition to the campaign for change. Whether it's human rights in Western Sahara, reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples, climate change, or corporate board diversity, shareholder engagement remains as important a tool now as it was then in the days of the task force on the churches and corporate responsibility. And we all, through our links to pension and endowment funds, have an opportunity that should not be missed.